If there was no soil microbes, I think the circle of life would stop. I think we'd all die.
None of my science team thought that we'd get anyone to change. What data affected you more than any other data that got you thinking, or?
Hearing that the land is unhealthy because we have not got the species of birds that should be here. That broke my heart. So I want it to be healthy, you know. That's our job, is to take care of it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Byck, and I am a professor of practice at Arizona State University. And what that means is I didn't come up through the academic world. I came up through the film world, and then they said, hey, why don't you do what you do over here? And I also run a 501c3 called Carbonation. And so when I made Carbonation, it was a film about solutions to climate change. And in the making of that film, we were kind of confused as to whether cows were a good thing or a bad thing. We said Meatless Mondays was a good thing, but we also were hearing this information about soils, and was grazing helping soils? And so when I finished the film and finished being on the road for 3 years with the film, I decided to do more research on that grazing. And what I found was holistic planned grazing, mob grazing, strip grazing, and what we ended up calling adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And it was this way of grazing cattle that made the land robust. And it was just tremendous to be on this land and see things. And it was working at scale. This is a 5,000 head herd of cattle in North Texas. And it was two people in their 60s, a husband and wife team, that moved them multiple times during the day. So it's not difficult. And it's all predicated on the bison, who are the best land managers certainly North America's ever had. And so what is AMP grazing? AMP grazing is you break up your farm into small paddocks. And this is just a symbol of it with electronic little single strip polywire. And so you move your animals 2, 3, 4 times a day, once a day. You make a bigger paddock and you go on vacation for a week, but it's very adaptive. And the main goal is to let most of the land rest most of the time. That's the main goal. And as compared to conventional grazing, which allows the animals to roam a large portion of the land, this is the neighbor across the fence from what I just showed you, and they'll let their animals go for 2 or 3 weeks in one of their paddocks, and they eat the grass super low, and then you can't even hide a golf ball. It's so low. Whereas with AMP grazing, they'll let the grass grow waist high, and then they'll only eat half, and they'll stomp the rest. And so what we really found was missing was science. So back in 2013, I was just starting at Arizona State, and I was lucky enough to start meeting scientists who were really interested in this type of grazing, but they weren't getting a lot of love at their universities or their agencies. But we brought them all together because ASU is not an ag university, so we didn't have a legacy of ag funding, so we were able to sort of get things going. And we put together a team, and it took us about 4 years to design and fundraise. And what we decided we wanted to study was about these metrics, these biological metrics of soil carbon, soil nitrogen, water infiltration, microbial life, the bugs above and below ground, the forage, how much forage, the nutrient density of the forage, birds, grassland birds as an indicator species for wildlife, greenhouse gas cycling, methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2, and then animal well-being and the farmer well-being. So that's what we were doing there. And my kids. They're now in high school. So what we did was we did a huge outreach to find the adaptive farmers, and through that we found 5 in the southeast U.S. And then we asked their neighbors, the neighbors who had the same soil type, would you allow us to do all this research we're doing on your adaptive neighbor's side? Would you allow us to do that on your side as well? And all 5 said yes, although there were a few discussions about dogs and guns before that happened. Let me just make sure. And so when we just back of the envelope, just sort of think about how much grazing land there is on Earth, it's 3.5 billion hectares. And so if you were able to draw down 1 ton of carbon into all those hectares, again, back of the envelope, best case scenario, huge task, you'd draw down about 1/3 of all human carbon emissions. That's what that's about equal to. So the potential is huge, actualizing it is huge, but we wanted to do the science to find out what is real. So our research also included a 4-part documentary series called Roots So Deep, You Can See the Devil Down There. And the first pair of farms were in Woodville, Mississippi, and this is the adaptive side, Cooper and Katie Hurst. And then their neighbors were the Fergusons, Wallace on the left, he's the son, and then Prentice and Margot are the parents. And so we made this documentary. So I'm going to show you some clips from the film, and I'm going to get into data and things like that. And so what I realized was Wallace Ferguson, the son, and Cooper Hurst, they've been friends for 25 years, and they had never once talked about grazing, and they're neighbors. Like, you're seeing both of the farms in that shot. And so being a filmmaker and curious and all those things, I asked them if they would get together and just sit down and talk about it. And the one thing that Wallace just couldn't get in his head was how Cooper wasn't putting synthetic fertilizer down. He was taught that that's how you get things done. So here's that scene. Oh, have you been over? Sorry about that. I set up the wrong scene. So this is them talking about their neighbors. Just, will they actually see? Have they actually noticed what's happening next door? Apologize for that. Have you been over to Cooper's this growing season or any time this year?
I had never been over to Cooper's place. But on the highway, the part that's there that you can see, you know, his grass, it'll be 3 or 4 feet tall. Now, in our pasture, the grass is not that tall.
I noticed it from the highway. I know, I've watched him, how he rotates. I know where, you know, what looks good and what doesn't. I'm always watching. You know, I cheat, I look, see what's going on.
I don't think that's cheating for him. I think he'd be glad to find out you were looking, to be honest.
He does a good job.
And so again, Cooper doing the amp grazing, Wallace, who you just heard, doing the conventional grazing. So now here's the scene where they had never spoken before about this after a 25-year friendship. And Wallace was having a hard time understanding you don't need to put synthetic fertilizer down, that the animals themselves are the fertilizer. What does that make you think? Like what he's saying right there, that's not the way you work.
No, but it's, I understand it. But the thing is, I'm just saying, that grass is gonna grow when you put fertilizer on it. Without putting fertilizer on it, you think I'm wasting my time even planting it. But
everything you're struggling with, we've been there. So you can't feel or say anything that we haven't said.
Yeah.
We've been there.
It's just hard to think of how you could do this without putting it up. I'm being honest.
Yeah,
I'm telling you right now,
Yeah.
you know my dad. Yeah. He's as good as gold. And you telling him you don't have to spend any more, he loves that. Yeah.
But I'm telling you, Dad would eat it up. He loves the land, he loves the farm, he loves his cattle.
But you know, if you're not spending money wastefully.
And that's where we are. We are not into wasting money. This much I absolutely know. The more pastures you have and the more you move the cattle, the more grass you will grow. That is undeniable, indisputable, and that's a fact. So you just start with your biggest paddock and cut it in half. It's just a matter of start splitting pastures with poly wire.
So one of the things that I did tell you we were studying birds, but one of the things we did not expect was the power of the birds for the farmers, especially quail. So here's a little extra on the quail story as well, starting with our quail scientist, Mike McGraw, out in the field.
Yes, bobwhite. Bobwhite.
If they say their name, Bob White. Just delightful to hear that sound in the landscape. From the 90s to 2014, the bobwhite averaged approximately 5% decrease in overall population. So there's been over 85% population decrease up to 2014.
I do know this, Peter. When I was younger, they had quail everywhere. They're not there anymore.
So have you heard Bob White's while we've been here?
Yeah, I have. That when we got, right before we came on the porch, I heard that. And I kind of thought somebody was messing with me. You know, you start hearing things. But I have had one or two 10 years ago.
This year, we're hearing quail from daylight to dark, from front to back, and everywhere in between. It really makes you think. It makes you think.
So I came back there a year later and I thought, I got Wallace. He's going to want to change. We got this. We got the money with the fertilizer. We got the quail with his heart. And when I got back a year later, he had never called Cooper. He'd never asked for any more information. And I realized that the job at hand, which was getting information to conventional farmers, was going to be a lot harder than I anticipated. None of my science team thought that we'd get anyone to change. So that was something real. Years later, we went back with the data from all the science teams and all the research that we did, and we got to share the data with the scientists, with the farmers. And here's the beginning of our data collection. This is the carbon, and I'm showing you folks' reactions to the data.
So for all farm pairs, all 5, averaged out, there's 72.5 tons of carbon per hectare in the AMP side of these farms, and there's 64 tons of carbon per hectare on the conventional side.
We saw about 13% more carbon on average across the AMP side, which is about 9 tons of carbon per hectare. That's a lot of carbon.
People ask how long carbon stays in the soil. It can be days, moving in and out of microbes quickly, or decades, getting trapped in dead roots, or centuries. The dead microbes are made of carbon and take centuries to decompose.
And so with the microbes themselves, there was 25% more and more active microbes on the adaptive side than the conventional side. And I like showing this next little clip because our microbial scientist, one of them anyway, Mike Lehman, he's from South Dakota, so being in the southeast US in July was not his idea of fun, so I just like to show a little grumpy scientist here.
If there was no soil microbes, I think the circle of life would stop. I think we'd all die. Not just us, but everything else.
So the next data we did also with the soil team, and the soil team's actually based at Colorado State, and we'll be at Colorado State tomorrow night showing the whole film, both episodes 1 and episodes 4. And so here's the nitrogen. That's about 9% more nitrogen on the AMP side, but the trick here is the adaptive farmers do not apply synthetic nitrogen. They don't have that cost. The conventional farmers do, and it can be huge amounts of money, as you'll see.
Yeah, I can remember writing a check for $90,000 on this farm one year on fertilizing, and the weather not cooperate, and literally get no growth. I mean, like no growth. And so that was when we looked at each other and we said, don't let any of us get weak-kneed again.
We never fertilized
and we never fertilized, and that's been 5 years. We never fertilized again. I just wish I had the money we had spent over the years, but we did what we thought we knew to do. That stress is totally off of us.
And so self-reporting from the farmers, it was $50,000 a year these farmers were writing checks. And this is before the Ukrainian invasion. So now this number is up to $150,000 a year. A lot of farmers are spending on fertilizer, hoping it'll work. The next thing we looked at, and we have a little result back here, does anybody here know the country band Alabama? Yeah. All right, so this is the bass player, Teddy. And Teddy's an adaptive farmer, and his cousin Randy lives next door, and he's a conventional farmer. So this was a very interesting study with family. And so we're telling Teddy about the water here. And overall in our study, the adaptive side got 3.5 inches of rain to infiltrate their soils each hour, and the conventional side was 1.5 inches. So that's why we say the phrase effective rainfall. How much rain is actually soaking in to your land? If we look at that 2 inches of difference, let's break it down. So 1 acre inch of water is 27,000 gallons. 2 acre inches of water is 54,000 gallons. So if you have a 1,000-acre farm, which is not unusual, that's 54 million gallons one side of the fence is getting into their system, replenishing, not washing away their soils, not eroding, than their neighbor. And so this is Teddy's reaction to that.
That's huge. I mean, that should make somebody want to change. I mean, that in itself, that in itself said, well, I mean, it's quite a difference. Wow.
So on the insect side, when we started, I was told, and I thought of it as ways of pest insect versus beneficial insect. And what we learned was that an insect could be a pest if it's living on a monoculture of one type of plant and it's gone wacko with its population. But that same insect could be a beneficial member of society if it's on a field with a lot of different plants growing, attracting a lot of different insects. And so this 33% more insect diversity is actually a huge sign of the ability for the communities to do their job. And recycling carbon is part of that. And so this was a finding that we didn't expect that clean. And all those insects are feeding birds, and so the birds, as an indicator species of wildlife, is why we studied them. We focused on the grassland birds in this part of the study, and there's a paper out of Cornell from 1970 to 2014, 51% of U.S. grassland birds are gone. And some of them even much higher. And so in our study in the southeast U.S., this is what we found. I like to let people read this one. It's a huge difference, right? And then in Kentucky, where one of our farm pairs was, we actually found this. Oh, sorry. So on the overall study, it's 442 birds, the population from 9 species on the AMP side, and 152 birds from 6 species on the conventional side. That's overall our study. Sorry about that, y'all. And then in Kentucky, we found on the adaptive side 31 birds from 5 species and 0 birds from 0 species on the conventional side. And so here we are with Mike McGraw, who will then lead into the Kentucky farmer learning this data.
So it just tells a story of a functional system and one that's broken, essentially.
That's sad. That's really sad.
What makes it sad?
Well, because, I mean, they don't have any place to live over there. They need a place to live. Where are they? They should be there. That's horrible. That is, it's terrible.
What do y'all think about the science that we've shared with you today? What thoughts are you having about what you've been presented?
It's showing things that I've been doing wrong for a long time. And I said, well, I've been making a mistake all these years,
It's not about mistakes. It's just about, hey, this might work better. That's all it is.
What we're supposed to do now. How do we get the carbon back? How do we do this?
So we then chose to let the data sink in. Just let the farmers live with it, not try to be pushy. Just let them live with it. And so winter set in. The next spring, we went back just to see if they had any thoughts on that data.
What data affected you more than any other data that got you thinking, or?
Hearing that the land is unhealthy because we have not got the species of birds that should be here. That broke my heart. So I want it to be healthy, That's our job, is to take care of it.
So We had 2 farm pairs in Alabama. Fort Payne was where Teddy and Randy were from Alabama, the band. And then down the way is a little town called Piedmont. And I just wanted to give you a little sense of side by side. I've been giving you averages of over the whole study, which was how the study was designed, but just to give you a sense of one farm pair. So you've got John Lyons Place, adaptively grazed on the left, and the Garrett Place, conventionally grazed on the right. John's been doing it for about 25 years, first generation farmer. The Garrett's 8th generation is now 6 years old, so they've been there for a long time. And so just looking at numbers and how much the land can hold and produce, the carrying capacity, John's running 135 head of cattle on 93 acres, and the Garretts are running 35 head of cattle on 80 acres. So if you average that out and do the math, that's about 3.5 times more animals on the adaptive side being raised because they're basically growing that much more forage. That's kind of it. Same rainfall, they're not irrigating either side. At the same time, and now we're talking about temporal carbon information. Before we gave you the information of carbon stocks, we just drilled down, got samples, sent them here to Colorado. That was a one-time snapshot. This is temporal. This is over a 2-year period with eddy covariance flux towers. And so even though John Lyons was grazing a lot more animals, he was drawing down a lot more carbon. So this is just the CO2, and now we're going to go into, again, back to the whole study, the 3 greenhouse gases, the CO2, the methane, and the nitrous oxide. And a lot of folks are just focusing on carbon. You're hearing a lot about carbon markets and things like that. If you're not focused on all 3 greenhouse gases, you're not really looking at the system. And so that's why we worked really hard, had to raise a lot more money, it takes a lot more time to get this information. And so I'm going to just play another little clip here about the greenhouse gases.
Our greenhouse gas team was also moving in the right direction, finally getting a good handle on the years of info they collected, finding out if AMP and conventional grazing were sources, warming up the planet, or sinks, cooling it down. Our science, like all science, was evolving. Here was our most current analysis. When we added up all our data for the carbon, the methane, and the nitrous oxide, AMP was a huge greenhouse gas sink, drawing down the equivalent of 3.3 tons of carbon per hectare per year. The conventional side surprised us. We thought it would be a source, but it was a sink as well, drawing down the equivalent of 0.8 tons of carbon. Even so, when thinking about climate change, the biggest bang for the buck was AMP. It was 4 times more powerful a sink than conventional. And if enough farmers choose to adopt it, AMP could be a strong solution to climate change. Farmers could help cool the earth.
So I just wanted to show you those numbers. A lot of people, I use carbon as the number throughout the film series, just one metric. But most of the scientific community, including the scientists on our team, they work in CO2 equivalent. So this is the carbon equivalent. This is accounting for carbon, for methane, and for nitrous oxide in carbon. And then here's the number accounting for it in CO2e, in CO2 equivalent. So methane warms the planet, no one's arguing with that. Nitrous oxide warms the planet, no one's arguing with that. It's just the AMP is drawing down so much more carbon that it's a sink, and we were surprised that the conventional too was drawing down enough carbon to create a sink, although not as strong. Our work is in the southeast U.S. There's a lot of work that's coming this way. Our team is now in the northern Great Plains, so not here, but north and a little bit east of here. But in the southeast U.S., just to give another sense of scale, there's 15.8 million hectares of grazing land. And if we got that 12.1 tons of CO2e drawdown across the southeast, that'd be about 191 million tons of CO2e per hectare per year, or CO2e across the southeast in a year. And so, again, huge ambition to get every farmer to change. Some people would call that impossible. We're going to give it a shot. But if we got those numbers about every 5 years and 3 months, we'd be drawing down a gigaton. So that's the scale and that's the potential. But it's only going to happen if farmers want to do it. I don't know if there's any farmers in here today. Are there any farmers in here today? There you go. Farmers don't like to be told what to do. I don't know anybody who likes to be told what to do, but especially farmers. So we hope that we can give data, give stories, and see and help folks change if they want to. And Alan Williams, who was going to be here with me today, but with the government shutdown, his trip to Colorado got canceled, even though the government didn't shut down. They shut down enough, or they were planning on it, so his trip got canceled because he was going to be with the USDA talking about this kind of work. But he's one of the best teachers out there. And so without Alan, this project would never have gotten off the ground. I met him 10 years ago, 10 and a half. And so that's the work. It looks like I got a little bit of time to do a little Q&A. And oops.
Did you calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from the nitrogen fertilizer? Because just extracting the fossil fuels, processing it,
Right.
is that part of your calculation?
No. So the question was, do we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from making nitrogen fertilizer, transporting nitrogen fertilizer, and then the emissions of nitrous oxide from using nitrogen fertilizer, much less the washing of that nitrogen fertilizer into the waterways and creating dead zones and things like that. We didn't touch that.
The conventional might not actually be a sink.
Right. It might not be a sink because of that piece. That's a very good point. The
other question.
Oh, here comes the mic.
It's on? Okay. The other question is, why do you call it conventional? Why don't you call it industrial ag versus regenerative ag or something? Because it's not conventional. It's only been conventional for the past, 30 years since we started creating pesticides. For 10,000 years,
Yep.
what you're considering to be this radical thing was conventional.
Yeah. What words we use are really important. I agree with you, and I agree that I wish it wasn't conventional, but conventional, 97% of farmers are doing it that manner right now, so that's why the word's being used. It really came into play in the mid-40s, so it's longer than 30 years. It's 55, 75, almost 80 years. I'm with you. Call it chemical versus regenerative, right? But we just had to use a word. We don't want to be pushing away folks. And one word could do great damage. So those are the things we were thinking about. And I walked into this as someone who knew nothing about it 15 years ago, and I'm using the words that were around. I hear you on the words, though, very much. Yeah. Here comes the mic. As a chemist.
Do you have the baseline chemistry for all the soils? Were they similar, or does it vary a lot?
No, the requirement for a neighbor being able to...
No, I know between neighbors it's not going to change that much. Overall, the whole project.
I mean, you want to say that, do we measure the entire southeast U.S.? Let me finish what I was saying, because you cut me off. We made sure that the soil types were exactly the same on both sides of the fence, or we wouldn't have picked the farm on the other side. And we did a really, really good job.
Oh, of course.
So that's apples to apples as much as possible in a very, very messy world of doing science.
So my next question is, Site 1, did the basic soil chemistry vary much from Site 5 or 10 or 15?
Yeah, there was definite variation across the 5 sites, yes.
Great, and can we get that information?
Yeah, it's already published.
Cool, thank you.
And it's if you go to carboncowboys.org, you'll see a tab called Research.
Yep.
And then under that's a tab called Published Research. And Mosier et al., that was the first paper that came out. That's on the carbon, the soil nitrogen. Then there's a second paper on the soil health. And we've got 9 papers published, and we've probably got another 9 in the pipeline.
And magnesium, iron content, et cetera, basic stuff like that?
You can dig right on in and get as
thank you.
detailed as you want. And I'm glad you actually asked those questions. The greenhouse gas data is not yet published. That's in the process of analysis and writing. A lot of the other data I shared with you is published. I think we got one more question.
Right here.
Hey.
Peter,
Hey, Bill.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been watching you over the years, which
Yes, you
is
have.
terrific.
There's a colleague of mine from Arizona State who we met 10 years ago when I got there. Yeah.
Yeah. So could you tell everybody, because you've been working on this for so long, what is the thing that gives you hope, and then what is the thing that surprised you the most?
The same thing. The conventional industrial neighbor was curious about what was happening across the fence. We were told that that person thought the other folks were crazy for doing adaptive, something different, something new. But they were curious, and that was across the board. That wasn't just in that one piece that I showed you here. And so that curiosity is a huge opportunity, right? And that's what gives me hope, because I can see how I could see how we could work with farmers to get them to change. And I'm now in the red zone, so I didn't show you the end of the movie, but if you live in Boulder, you can go to the dairy on Tuesday and watch it, because we're screening our film on Tuesday night. Free food at Carita, come watch the movie, and I'm not going to take more than 20 seconds extra, so thank you all very much.